Welcome to Allegedly Doesn't Replicate, a podcast by the Institute for Replication, where we put research to the test again. In this episode, Nate Breznau tells us about his experience with many-analyst projects.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Juan Pablo, and we have our co-host, Abel. And today we have a special guest, Professor Nate Breznau from DEI Bonn. I promise I wouldn't try to butcher the name, but here I am. Nate, welcome to the podcast. Why don't you tell us a bit about yourself, and then we can get into your paper today.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's good that you started that way, so it takes the pressure off. I work at the German Institute for Adult Education, Leibniz Institute for Lifelong Learning. So in Germany, we try to set records for the longest possible words and institute names. Just real quick, my background is I did a PhD, my graduate studies in sociology a while ago. I finished in 2013. And my research generally revolves around public opinion and social policy. At least that was the topical interest that I picked up early on. And I found myself a lot in political science-y type areas. And then some things happened that probably happened to maybe all of us here that really kind of pulled me, or I couldn't sleep at night if I kept going like that, and had to kind of get involved in open science and meta science. And just a small correction, I'm not a professor, so I'm just a researcher and this institute it's a research institute I was always at universities, and then this is my first job at just a sort of standalone research institute.
No more teaching, no more supervising.
Supervising, yes, but
Nice.
no more teaching.
So the best of both worlds.
Well, actually, I really like teaching, but
Yeah.
as you know, at least one of you, teaching, grant acquisition, supervision of so many people. So I have a much smaller world of people I might supervise now, publish or perish. It's far too much. So removing teaching improves my work-life balance and quality of life for sure. But I think that's one of the best, most important things we do as scientists.
For sure. Nate, we are extremely intrigued by your recent working paper with Borjas, the one that came up in NBER. And when we reached out, you said, look, guys, this paper is interesting and all, but the story goes way back. And it starts with a paper in PNAS that was published a bit ago. So why don't you tell us a bit about it and how it all came together, and basically go crazy with it and tell us all about it.
All right, absolutely. So around 2016, my memory is not super crystal clear. If my wife was here, she'd get the exact day and month of everything. She's got a near photographic memory. I'm the other end of the spectrum. But around 2016, Eike Mark Rinke and Alexander Wutke, a communications research and a political scientist, we were all in Mannheim at the University of Mannheim. And there was, Alex put forth the idea, there was some funding. It's pretty early in the game for like a conference, and proposed that we, like a postdoc conference, and proposed we do an open science conference. And we already were aware that we were in the early stages of our thing. And so we were like, yeah, cool, let's organize a conference. And then we were like, hey, let's do something really different, really cool. And when I listened to Abel's description of how he came to the replication games, I'm like, man, that's like exactly how we designed this thing. We were sitting around and just like, hey, let's just do this. Let's just, we'll try this. It'll be. And so we started brainstorming what we could do. And we were all really taken by this many-analyst study. I'll say many-analysts. There's so many terminologies out there, right? I'll just say many-analysts. That took place from like Silbertson and Brian Nosek and Eric Ullmann and a bunch of people, and they put together these different analysts, and analyzed the same data. And I had never seen anything like that, and I thought it was so cool. I was just like, whoa, this is so cool, And so I said, hey, let's do something like that. And so then we went back and forth with ideas and around and around. And we ended up settling on an area where I'm at. So it was like policy preferences and immigration. And the reason that we thought it might be interesting is because it's secondary data that everyone could have seen already, right? The original study was like, no one's ever seen this data. That's what they thought was really interesting about it. We're like, well, let's do what would happen if it's secondary data. People have already seen it. They could, peaking, whatever. They've already published studies on it. And it's an area where there's studies going in every direction. And so I was like, yes, we're going to figure it out. We're going to figure out why these, what's the truth? We're going to figure out the truth, maybe the ground truth or whatever. And so we somehow settled on that, and we did some kind of power analysis, and I think we needed like 40 teams for it to work. And we were blown away when we got 89.
Wow.
So we got 89 teams. We were just advertising it in social media and through our networks and emails and stuff, and we got 89 teams. And so we were like, cool. And so we designed the study and we went with it. And it was a nightmare. It was an absolute nightmare. So again, Abba, when you were talking about this one team where they're like, hey, this isn't really replicating. And then if you come back an hour later and they're like, it's really crazy. That's kind of like what happened to us. We're really excited and creative people. So we were like, first, they're going to do a reproduction. They're just going to try to reproduce the results from a study computationally as a way to bring everybody up to speed. So, because, it'd be all these different people from different areas. And then they're going to try to expand it. And in the middle, we're going to have like a deliberation, but only like a split sample. So we're going to have a deliberation, treatment, random assigned group. And the participant fatigue was crazy. So already the first task was like huge. Do a computational reproduction. That's what you know a lot about, Abel, and probably you also, Juan. Sometimes that's a ton of work. You've got the data, and they even shared their code. Although we did another experimental condition where half the people didn't get the code or much information about the methods, and they were asked to reproduce.
Poor people.
They just got the data. I'm sorry if anyone listens to this. But so that took a ton. So actually, in 2 days, I was told by Royal Society Open Science that the results of that first computational reproduction should appear. And that has 85 teams on it. Well, you already said, the PNAS paper, which has the extension, like what is the data generating model? What do you think? What's your ideal model? Ended up with 73 teams, and only 71 of them produced numerical results. And that's the dropout, because people were like, oh my gosh, we had to stop. At the end of the study, I couldn't ask them for anything more, even though it was like, oh my gosh, we really need to get them to like redo some things. Their code's not right. Anyways, so that's where we ended up. And basically what happened was, if for all of those in the audience who haven't seen the PNAS paper, they got results testing the hypothesis that immigration reduces support for social policy, and they went in every direction: negative results, positive results, a bunch of sort of what you might call null results, and different shades of gray all over there. And I have to be honest, I was kind of devastated. So I was like,
what was your pride?
Part of me was like, I thought we were going to find those key decisions that sent results in a certain direction.
Oh.
And right away, I was like, ooh, I don't think so. I could just see the enormity of what was going on. And I was like, darn, I kind of thought it was kind of a failure in some ways. And I'm so grateful to Ike and Alex, because they really constructed the PNAS story. I don't want to call it a story, but like what's in the data that it would be so important to the community. Because I was just like, oh, we learned nothing about immigration and social policy preferences, and we learned nothing about the modeling process. I was thinking like, well, if you control for GDP, or if you just select rich Western democracies, and these things mattered a tiny, tiny bit, but almost not at all in the bigger picture. So they were like, hey, and I was still sort of pre-meta science. I was open science, but sort of pre-meta science. I didn't this many-analyst studies, the first time I pre-registered anything. It was the first time I did this kind of I had run a bunch of regressions. That's kind of like meta science, but this was something totally different. But they were like, hey, there's this whole community. And so we put those results together, and it was interesting. And that study kind of put me on the map. And I mean, look, here you guys are economists, and I'm like trained as a sociologist, and here we are together. And no offense, but traditionally economists, especially, and psychologists too, they really don't do much outside of their discipline traditionally, and that's just been really true. And I've always felt kind of like, oh, that was economists, and this meta science and open science it just crosses all the
It does.
boundaries. It has to, as you know, right? You can't do meta science and stay in your discipline. I mean, you kind of can, but everything that it is, the question it's asking, it's being asked in all the other disciplines too, almost always. So that happened. Maybe if you want to ask anything about that, now's probably
Lots
a
of
good time,
questions.
or I will
No,
fast forward to George Borjas.
No, I do want.
I've got lots.
I wanted to ask something about, was it your experience? Your experience was somehow the same? Like, did you have like an aha moment? This is not working, but or was it completely different?
I mean, for us, like, I guess, for replication games, I remember the first event, the first team, I assigned them the paper, and I remember, like, within a few hours, they found, like, catastrophic coding errors that completely shattered the results. And, like, a comment was published really quickly by by this team, and the paper was originally published at Journal of Political Economy, but that's the moment I realized, oh my goodness, we're about to change things. And I was not ready for that. Like, I was not anticipating that it would be like that big really right away. And there's tons of things you cannot anticipate. And even recently we started doing replication games, but for psychology. It just like completely opened my mind on the idea that reproduction means something completely different in other disciplines. And you would think that I would know this as the chair of the Institute for Replication. And I guess I knew, but just talking to people in other disciplines, they just have different ways of doing things. Different terms mean different things. But I would say, like, also the challenges are different. Like, trying to convince a psychologist to do like a robustness check is so hard, but they are completely into the idea of comparing the pre-analysis plan and pre-registration to the actual study. That's something they really want to do. Whereas you tell an economist, like, yeah, don't do coding, just look at the pre-registration, they find it incredibly boring. So there's like a lot of different challenges, I feel like, when you have these big events or like these big projects, and then you need to contact the replicators, and you need to contact people who are part of a team of many analysts. You need to interact with them. They need to provide you information. You have this insane amount of emails, this mailing list. People change affiliation. They're outside of academia. There's so much going on. Like, Nate is just like, agreeing 100%. It's completely crazy when people don't realize the scope of these projects is insane. And one question I had for you, Nate, like you said at the beginning, you were hoping for like 40 based on like a power analysis. To me, that's the most interesting thing of like these many analyst exercises. I don't know how many teams you need. I don't know how much power you need, because I have no idea what's the effect size we're after. And there's going to be so many variation, and so, like, we know now based on your work and the work of other people that like the point estimates are usually all over the place. So then you start to wonder, like, how many teams are you going to need to be able to show a pattern like this? Because now I feel like the null has changed. It's not anymore like, oh, let's try to figure out like that control matters, this controls, like this was your prior, and I guess it's a prior of a lot of people. But actually, how many teams do we need to be able to say, okay, for that research question, you need X number of teams to be able to say point estimates are all over the place, or they're actually pretty much always close, and we know at least the sign is negative most of the time. Like, what's your take on that?
Yeah, that was another thing we tried to contribute because we noticed that you couldn't really statistically analyze the very few at that time, many analyst studies that had happened because, 17 teams, 27 teams or whatever, you just couldn't do it. And so that was my idea, is we'd be able to explain the results somehow with some statistical method. But the 40 was actually for like a medium-sized Cohen's d, or like standardized effect size. We would need 40 for a one-way, to go from that study that they were going to reproduce, like their findings. If we split the sample 20 and 20, that if to get a one-way effect size that was medium, to have the power to detect that, and that's a pretty big effect size in social science, right? A medium Cohen's d is actually huge, kind of. We would need that sample size, and so we were really we were super eager, like, hey, we're going to do all this different and right, and we're going to, make a point with that, like, pre-register, power analysis. But actually, it turns out that our study is incredibly underpowered. If you think about, in the end, we ended up coding. I mostly, especially qualitatively, had to code. So I was coding the code of the teams to figure out what decisions they had made. And I needed to get categories that I couldn't code every decision, right? But I needed categories that would fit across. And we ended up with some that made no sense, like used a Bayesian estimator. It's like, what's that? Like that could be almost anything, but only like 3 teams did it. So I just had that was one decision, that they shared. And so I coded all these decisions, and I came to over 100 that were kind of at least 2 teams had done. Teams that uniquely did something. It was like, I can't.
No.
That variable just uniquely identifies the team. So if you take these 100 decisions and mix them up in their potential combinations, we've got like, 3% of the matrix of possible data covered or something. So I guess that was the real finding. Every single model submitted by every single team, and some teams submitted like over 100 models and some teams submitted just one. That was another thing we definitely didn't expect, was different in some way, usually in a lot of ways. But single one was unique.
Interesting.
And that was 1,000, over 1,100 models for those 73 teams. 71 is numerical results.
So I was wondering, how did you go from having all this variation and thinking, oh my God, what have we done? Everything's wrong, to the idea of, okay, let's see how the ideological bias, how the ideology is shifting the way these people think about the estimates. Because now it seems like a natural question to ask, right? Like ex post, like you're always like, oh, of course, that's a very good question. But looking back at it, I guess it would have been a very different scenario. So how did you come up with the idea, and how did you test it? Tell us, like, promote your paper.
Yeah, this fits really well. So the whole project took kind of 4 years of my life, and it was really, really, really hard. I got to be honest.
Wow.
I'm happy to laugh about it now. It's over, but it was really brutal. And so I thought I could easily just kind of put the decisions down on paper. Yeah, this team used this team used that, they used those control variables. No. The code was super complicated. We wanted to replicate all of it. It didn't replicate. We're going back and forth. Here I learned crazy things like we had the exact same code. We're running M+. A couple teams use M+, and the results are different. I got the same code. Yeah, I ran that code. I have the same starting data. Check it. We went back and forth. And it was like, oh, you're using version 7 and I'm using version 8, and the defaults changed because something, evolved, and they said, oh, we need to make this the default now. And it's like that that stuff drove me out of my mind. I nearly lost it. I really had like kind of a breakdown. But anyways, so that was super crazy. So fast forward a little, we've got the PNAS publication and whatnot. Last December, maybe, I'm just like minding my own business, and I get an email from George. Oh, who's this George guy? And he says, I'm analyzing your data for this project, and I think there's something miscoded. I can't figure something out. And I was like, sure. I replied right away, of course, was like, yeah, okay, no problem, but please give me some time. I was involved in some other things. And then like a week passed, and he emailed me again. He's like, yeah, I actually figured it out. You definitely have the hypothesis. So we have a variable if they subjective belief in the hypothesis, before when the study started, we asked them if they believed the hypothesis was true. And I had reverse coded it simply, like, no big deal. It actually doesn't matter at all. But he figured that out. And then I was like, oh yeah, if there's something, I immediately took the position, like, if there's something wrong with the study, I'm happy to, take responsibility. We're very open. And then he was like, no, you misunderstand me. And then we got into this thing, and anyways, what happened was, at some point he said, look, what you've done here, no economist would ever do, because it would ruin their career. Because they need a job paper. They need to get, right away into the job market. They got to do this. And he said, I see, and this is before I told him what I just told you about how much work it was. He said, I see how much work you did in this. It's incredible. It's crazy. But he said these things, and I was like, oh, he gets me. He really, he saw what I had done, because he went through and wanted to study this. And he had dinner with one of the participants in it. That's how he kind of heard about it, or got more into it. Anyways, he found this correlation, and he's believed that this is true. He works with immigration. He's been an economist that's worked with immigration for a long time.
In many debates with other well-known economists on the same topic.
Yes.
Any economist listening right now knows exactly what you're talking about.
Good. But he was convinced that, that the ideology of these researchers is driving their modeling decisions and their results that they want to present or know in advance that they're going to come to. Nate, and then
sorry to interrupt. Do you think these decisions are conscient or unconscious? Like, do you think it's a decision that you make as a researcher?
Okay, I'm going to answer that question in like 30 seconds. So coming out of sociology, I only know economists who are really in my area, or meta scientists. George is neither. And so let me Google this guy. And I was like, oh, I was like, this guy's like one of the most famous working economists right now. And I was like, oh, I kind of brushed him off at first, and it's a good, kind of check yourself moment. Science should never be done about status. That's part of the whole problem. We've got this, it should be done about science. But I had that moment where I was like, oh man, whoa. But he wanted to, he was like, I want you to have credit. I don't want to come in here and take your data and make a publication. I want you to have credit. How can I give you credit? And I was like, I don't know, like what? So we kind of went around with it, but he was really at the beginning. He basically had a correlation and some modeling, and our repository is super complex because there's models nested in teams and there's individuals nested in teams. Mm-hmm. And, the individuals don't exactly link to the models. So you have this crazy data structure plus the data that the teams use to analyze. So I got engaged with him. We had a great exchange, and I immediately told him, I'm like, look, I got to say, I'm a little biased. Like, economists like Alicina basically used our exact models and gave us no citation and this and that. And he's like, oh yeah, I'm not surprised. He's really a really friendly guy. It was really nice, and it was fine. So we got our paper together, which from the NBR working paper series. I didn't believe it's true. I have a hard time believing it's true. That, like, so obviously, so easily true. Mm-hmm. And so I set out to disprove it. I was like, because he sent me like his model that he thought was probably the model, and he had coded teams like a real certain way. And I was like, yeah, I'll just do it a different way and it'll be gone. But what I didn't realize is he had already done all of that. He had tried it every way, and he had just put it the one that he found most logical. But I only found that out later. And so I was like, well, I can't make this go away. We run it every single way. You're George Borjas. You're basically offering me to work on this with you. So then we just started putting together the paper. I would say I was listening to your podcast, probably the second episode, walking around the courtyard taking a break today, and you asked the same question, or this same question came up, coming back to your question about are these conscious or unconscious decisions? And it occurred to me at that moment that like we would really have to define what we mean with those terms to really answer that question. Because I mean, this was more about p hacking when you guys were talking about it, but like the decisions are definitely conscious when we're, it's like, let me test this, let me test that, I'm going to try this model, this is how we do it here in this discipline, or I think it looks like it needs this estimator. These are very conscious decisions, but there is some unconscious aspect to it. For example, a lot of people just do what they learned, where they were trained, and this is not necessarily, what is that, like
Yes.
I don't, we don't know what kind of bias is built into what we've learned. Like there's people who just do factor analysis a certain way, and there's others who do it a different way, and there's other people who like collapse and then do weighting, and there's others who do like weighting and then collapsing, and it just sort of, there's people who use Stata and people who use R, and even they will probably get different results just because the way you do research with the two is slightly different. So the argument as it stands, the best logic that I feel comfortable with saying is, we looked at like these models lead to certain models lead to certain results. And I figured this out, especially recently. You can explain a lot of the variation in our results if you do interactions of a bunch of variables at once. We were looking for key variables. So we were very narrow in hindsight. I would just like variable for variable. We did a few interactions that made sense, but actually you need like categorically all the combinations of, well, if you use rich Western democracies and you control for GDP and you do not use unemployment, boom, you've got like always model, then you've got these models that do positive or whatever. And so the teams had the chance to look at the data. They had done the computational reproduction, right? So they'd seen the data. And then they submitted their models. They were supposed to pre-register their models with us, but we kind of messed that up because we didn't give them a standardized format for doing it. We just said, tell us what models you're going to use before you run them. We'll sort of trust you. And so we got everything from, I'm going to do like OLS with fixed effects with this. And then we got other ones that were like a 2-page description of exact, with every little detail. So these were not comparable in the end. But most teams stuck to that, whatever they described. There's a lot of playroom for a lot of them. So if it's true, I mean, the thing is, there's very few teams with a kind of anti-immigration position. The question is, should immigration policy be like tightened or loosened, basically, in your country? Should it be made stronger or more relaxed? That's what it was. And then they had a thermometer scale, and those who actually said in the direction of made stronger, which was rare among social scientists, not surprisingly, I would say. Especially, these are a lot of sociologists and political scientists, like just a few economists mixed in. They really found negative results. They found some of the biggest negative results, and it was just like, huh. And then much more teams with positive, among them were the only teams that found really big positive results. And you have to have specific combinations of variables to get those. I can't possibly say if it was conscious or unconscious. I also can't define those terms super clearly. If, let's say, they're already embedded in a discipline that tends towards a certain finding, it's like unconscious, but this is how we know these models. Maybe they've published in it, so I'm just going to do my, and yeah. I'll just stop there, but that's where we came to. But it's like one of these correlations that won't go away. So it's the opposite problem, right? Normally you can just make it go away so easily. You just do a little change and poof, everything's gone. And here it's like, it just doesn't go away.
And so when you're doing combinations of variables, how do you do this? Were you sort of thinking like multiverse, let me look at every single possible combinations of what people have done and trying to find like, here is this interacted, like rich countries interacted with this, or like what was the idea, or more like looking at teams that are more at the extreme and sort of learning from these teams. How do you get there?
Well,
So
George dug into the data and found this association. And whether we use like a continuous scale or categorized teams or whatever, we got it. George didn't really have anything to do with the combinations of variables other than to say, look, based on these 6 variables, I can kind of show that this combination of them. Actually, he was trying to do what I did and find the specific variables. But I have been working with these guys who are sort of like followers of Lemur, if this name rings a bell, and they're like, and they built an app to do this kind of robustness check. But you could run millions of models through some kind of quasi-random sampling, and you'd only need to really actually run a subsample, and you could get this. It's really cool, and we actually have a preprint out. But anyways, they showed me, yes, our findings held. Like no single variable explains anything. It's like a huge multiverse, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a single pipeline, but a huge multiverse. It's at the next level, the interactive level. And so that's where I started to realize, yeah, of course it is. That should have been obvious, but I was so focused on what's that key variable or that key decision. And so I brought that kind of into the paper. I'm like, George, the truth is, like, I've already kind of figured this out. It's not published or anything, but I know it's true. So then he was like, yeah, okay. So the teams have sort of realized that consciously or unconsciously, and gone, and those modeling decisions are what produce the results, kind of obviously, And so here's this strong correlation, which I think we do a pretty modest job of saying. It makes a lot of sense, right? That's a theme on your show. It's like findings that make a lot of sense are very intuitive, and especially with a lot of the stuff that's going on with science and with the media and whatnot, we would be not necessarily the sort of good guys. Let's say it depends whose team you're on, but like it's like with this anti-woke stuff, if people are like, oh yeah, see, ideological bias is shifting the results, and it's like I wouldn't be jumping around so excited to be pointing figures, but I'm on the side of science for sure. So this is like the perfect setup because it's a topic you can't really study, right? It's almost impossible to study.
There's no
How do
contrafactual,
you study this? We just got lucky. Like I asked that question thinking like we just need to control for this stuff, right? It was not my target to study, right?
Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
So it's very rare that you read a paper that changes your view of not only your discipline, but also the whole thing you're doing, right? Because everyone that does a PhD kind of believes in science in a sense. Like you don't go around spending, I don't know, 10 years of your life not to believe in this stuff. So once you read your paper or your MBI paper, like it clicks that perhaps we're just publishing our own biases. You know what I mean? Like we're just finding fancy ways of doing some metrics and reaffirming our own biases, right? As a person. Do you think that's the case, or what do you think it's the overall message for the scientific community? Like, what do you think is the broader implication of your paper? Because the more I think about it, the more it becomes like a fundamental question of how do we do science, and I don't even know what to do about it. I just feel like an overwhelming sensation of dread,
Yeah. For me, it makes me pause because I is so focused on the perverse incentive structures in science, and the status orientations and all this other stuff. And I gave up quite a long ago in thinking that science really shapes policy. I think there are branches of economics where it definitely does, but especially in sociology, it has like more normative and societal implications, but it rarely shapes policy. And I remember in my early papers, I tried to draw some policy conclusions, and I realized in hindsight, whoa, that's really actually dangerous. I'm mixing myself into something that's not my area. Like
You're becoming an economist, Nate.
I'm here to present the knowledge, not to say what should be done with it, right? Because as soon as I say what should be done with it, well, that's bias, isn't it? I mean, it's a kind of bias because it means, I mean, it's a framing. Let's not say bias, let's just say framing. It's a, right? Because with a lot of results, you could conclude in a lot of different directions. And by then we've sort of earned the right, like, all right, we did this great study and boom, 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 boom. So we've kind of earned the right in the discussion section to kind of say what we want, at least part of it. You know, we have to be humble and blah, blah, blah. But there's always a paragraph that we sort of earned. And I don't know if that's a great, I feel now like, oh, that could be quite dangerous because people might put a lot of weight on that and not as much on the findings themselves. So
I've changed my mind a lot on this. I mean, I used to agree with you. And I guess over time, I sort of changed my mind because if you don't do it, someone else is going to do it for you and might do it in a bad way. Might take your results, misunderstand them, and just run with it. And I'm not saying adding a paragraph in the conclusions is going to save the world and people cannot anymore disagree with you or like misinterpret or communicate your results. But I feel like there's a part where you could do it in a somewhat objective way without making like crazy general like implications or policy recommendations. But I feel there's a space and there's a way to do it. I don't think most people know how to do it. I definitely don't know how to do it, but I feel it's part of your job. Like there's a reason why you've done this. And if it's a policy relevant question, like why are you studying this? Like why are you writing
I think
this?
I know what you mean.
Working with
But
data? I don't know. Juan, do you want to jump in?
oh, he might be frozen.
Yeah, but I don't know. I think there's a point where you might do it yourself rather than letting other people take your papers and do whatever they want with it. I guess that's how I've changed my mind on the topic. But I think a lot of economists, and I think even the NBER, like working papers, has this disclaimer that, or you cannot actually make, I think, policy recommendations in an NBER working paper or something like that. They actually have a policy against that. So I think a lot of economists are actually, I guess siding with you where they just want to be very careful and they don't make these policy recommendations. Juan, are you back?
I'm back. Sorry about that.
No problem. I appreciate a lot what you said, Abu, because I imagine, so the headline like anti-woke research, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, hey, whoa, a little out of context, although the media will do anything it wants.
They will do it anyway, but, But you could, you could provide a package. I think, I always take the medical sciences as an example just because it's more potent or whatever. And usually, they will release a paper like in JAMA or New England Journal of Medicine or whatever. And then the media, they have experts who need to understand this. And often it's really hard to understand what the hell they're talking about with these drugs and terms and so on. But they will often communicate with like the researchers, or the researchers prepare with the help of their university sort of a package, a media package. And then people can actually release it and it's going to get in the news the way that the researchers actually want it. And I feel sometimes you have to do that just because otherwise like anyone can do whatever they want with it.
I think this is something I also listened to in your earlier episodes about mechanisms. So if a person understands the mechanisms of the policy well, like what are the steps in the policy that are taking place, like throughout the sort of whole policy life cycle, then, and they could say, so if this, then that, if this, then that, like with the policy recommendations, that would probably be super correct, let's say, if they're going to make policy recommendations, especially if they give some if-then conditions of like, well, this this would implicate policy this way if these and these, kind of like a causal analysis or something like that. It's definitely not what people do, obviously, right? I haven't read papers in that direction. There's some in this sort of evidence-based policy literature that try to maybe do that,
But you have to, accumulate knowledge to some extent. And at one point, there are things that people would just understand. Like, take your paper, for instance. Like, now you could literally have someone reading this quickly and being like, oh, actually, it's not one variable that explains whether you agree or not with this claim. It's a bunch of variables. And if you look at this specific set of countries like this, usually you get that. I think, the average person can understand this. I'm not saying they will. I'm not saying your paper will completely change the way everyone thinks about like migration. But I think you just need a couple of people who are really good at taking this, making it clear, putting this on social media, and you could have like a huge impact and change the way people think about these debates. And I don't think like it's that complicated. I think researchers actually are not spending enough time trying to communicate their results. I think we're just terrible at it. So we sort of give up. But anyway, it's a tangent. But I'm trying to understand, like, I love many-analyst. I've done a bunch now. It's an insane amount of work. And I don't know like how to conclude like often because there's so many units and disagreement but there's also all these studies now that are trying to, because this is a new method, this is a new thing, so people like to criticize it. And obviously it's not perfect. Like, what do you think of people who say like, well, first of all, it's really costly, you cannot always do this. Second, it depends how you frame the question. Some questions are open-ended. Some questions are like, what's the effect of this on this in that setting? And there you destroy, like, you limit the choices that researchers can make. Like, what do you make of, like, I think to me they're the two biggest criticism of many analysts. Maybe there are others that I forget, but like, what's your take on this? Because you're the man and you've really popularized these methods. So what do you make out of this?
This is a debate that George and I are having currently because we were thinking of a second paper that relates to their subjective conclusions about the hypothesis. So we asked them to not only give us their numerical results, but then to ask them hypothesis supported, hypothesis rejected, who cannot be can't with these data, it's not testable. Basically, this is not testable with these data. Those were the choices that they had, and some teams, several, like 8, insisted that they sent us 2 conclusions. And a couple were very strong about it. That's why I allowed the other teams who were just not so strong about it. And they were like, look, the flow of immigration, net migration, so over year change, is something totally different than the stock of people who are like foreign born in a country. And I have to say, I agree. So if you use those 2 variables, it's 2 different like estimand. I really like this new concept of estimand. Like, what's your estimand? What is that exact thing that you're testing? And George sees it differently. He's like, no, this is immigration. These are just different ways of measuring immigration, but it's immigration. And I think, does immigration reduce support for social policy is more like should probably be classed more like a research question than a hypothesis. Mm-hmm. I mean, yes, at a very broad level, it's a hypothesis, but if you just use it like that, it's basically like you're saying it's true everywhere, sort of, and let's test that, and it's kind of like true everywhere, no matter how you measure it. And this is not a very helpful to science hypothesis. And so I'm like, well, we have to split those teams into the models with stock of immigrants and flow of immigrants and have 2 different conclusions. So we split, and he's like, that doesn't make any sense. The teams are, illogical and incoherent. And this is a terrible, committing some terrible fallacy. And maybe economists are a bit more, certain things are like a no-no. And this is like a big no-no. And so he's like, we can't do that.
But is it related? Is it related to the idea that if you start doing this, where do you stop? because you could say, well, is it the flow of stock, or is it rich country or poor, or is it this or that, or is it, you could always say like, well, all these teams are making this. Like, I feel like you're going back to the idea of, well, yeah, I mean, that's what you're testing. You're
Right.
testing the fact that everybody has their own definition and own, preferences over how to code this. So if you remove one of these,
what happens?
Decisions, I think, needs to be stock. Well, then you're just making the research questions like less, I don't know, less broad. Like, isn't it related? Like,
it's a fair point, but that's the only data that we gave them. So we said, and it came from the literature. The literature usually tests those two as the two kind of. So we gave them that data, so they were sort of obliged. So it's possible that they would have themselves might have said, "Hey, stock only." Although that option was on the table for the teams. So the teams, for example, that sent in one model, they had decided, "Hey, this is the best data generating model right here to test." But yeah, you have a fair point. I just feel like, having worked in the area, it's like, yeah, we're comparing change, something that you might really notice and might be hyped up in the media, to like stock, which might not change at all for 10 years. You might have sort of 20% immigrants and it's constant for 10 years. And this to me is like very different. But I only see it as a practical thing, because we want to test if their bias or their policy position, ideology, relates to how they how they draw their subjective conclusion. And trying to split a team in half, when they went in two different directions, it's like, starting to learn more about how economists' minds sort of tick. I see why this is like, you can't just do that.
Interesting.
Nate, I think it is that.
Yeah.
Oh, no, finish.
No, I just wanted to. And what about just the idea that, like, which research questions should we use a many-analyst approach for? Just
right.
to conclude the episode.
This is a really important, yeah.
And what's the future of the technique?
Yeah, so these guys that I was working with, they're from Italy, and it's Arnold Pai, Andrea Saltelli, and Alessio Lacci. And they kind of approached me because they wanted me to give them what are the typical modeling strategies, and they were going to run their app, their method to test. It opened my eyes to something. We're having a really hard time selling it because they're really like more in the mathematical world. and I'm in the many-analyst world, and so many-analyst doesn't really mean anything to them. And I'm like, well, we got to sell this to a many-analyst crowd, so we're really struggling how to package and present this. But what my eyes suddenly opened to is like, wow, if you have the data in advance, the potential PIs of the potential many-analyst study should analyze it extensively to see if there is actually the possibility to understand the inner workings of the data, or if it's just chaos. Because if it's like, we would have seen immediately in our study, if we had run like crazy tons of models on the data, that they were going to go every direction, and that also we wouldn't be able to see key variable. We would have been able to know a lot about that in advance. And you're right, this was super costly. It was super time consuming for all these people. So it's good. We're it's at the beginning. It's good breaking ground. But I think it's from a cost benefit analysis, this would be a great way to do this, because almost basically all the many-analyst studies are similar in the sense that the results go all over the place.
Yeah, but I always question myself whether it's because you cherry pick research questions where there's no consensus in the literature.
Well, like for example, the NOSEC study, okay, is there racial prejudice? As a sociologist, I'd be like, definitely. Like, it just depends at what level and where and how, like it's there, it exists. But, and so I guess, I don't know. If I had designed that study, I would have guessed we're probably going to find evidence of racial prejudice. whereas in our study, I chose it because it went in every direction in the published literature, because I thought that's where we need the study. That's where we need to figure out what's going on. But I only contributed to the lack of knowledge, or possibly like, hey, let's just call this a null result, maybe. Although I don't really support that conclusion, but others have kind of taken it out. Like, look, 60% of the findings are like sort of not, or they're not within a 95% confidence interval or something. So costly. I don't see future benefit. I see as very reduced without big changes in the way that they're done.
Interesting.
No, but I think
although they're a great thing to invoke. If you say, it's like, so George, for example, working with George, he's not a meta-scientist at all, or wasn't, and so he wrote the paper sort of like a labor economist,
Yes.
And we sent it around to people, and I really followed his lead there. I was really just doing data analysis and extracting stuff that we needed to, and we sent it around to a bunch of people, and half of them were like, hey, this is a meta-science paper, like, don't, you're starting with sort of labor economics and this and that, and of course it's a meta-science paper, right? I mean, it goes in the meta-science literature. And if people could know just simply know if 70 researchers did analyze the same data, they would probably get all different results. And if they really believed that, you'd have to be really sociopathic or scientificopathic to not like engage in much more robustness checking.
I agree.
Juan?
I think this is a great point. Sorry, I'm jumping all over the place. Oh no,
you've had the least opportunity to ask questions and also got dropped, so I thought you should have some time. It's not my podcast, but
no, I think this is just a great place to finish it, because it's a great conclusion to the paper and to the episode, I guess. The conclusion. Any last thing that you wanted to say, or Abel wants to ask?
No, thanks a lot, Nate. Been following your work for years, so this is it's really exciting where this is going.
This is amazing.
Congrats.
Yeah, and I also am a big fan of your work, and I only knew it after it was kind of famous. So hearing some of the backstories now for me is really interesting, because it's really incredible the more time I spend in the sort of open science, meta science community, how we fall, or we are sort of forced into this. It's like a lot of stuff that looks like it was decisions you made. It was just, this happened to you, and I think a lot of people should appreciate that, and that's science, like there was a moment where I said, oh man, and a lot of people said to me, like, don't follow this open science stuff. It's just going to be a rabbit hole, get focused on your career, get that big publication, get that professor position. And I couldn't, like, it was smacking me in the face, it was just smacking me in the face.
But I think,
and so, yeah,
for you and I think there's a lot of people who follow this advice, and they just see science and they're just like, this cannot be it. Like, clearly there's a lot of biases going on and they don't like it. I think some people just keep going. They try to get this big publication. Other people do the open science, like you and I. I think there's a good amount of researchers who actually drop out of academia just because
they're disillusioned with the process.
Completely, yeah. And instead of moving to open science, they're just like, screw this, I just don't like it. I don't like this publication games.
For sure.
So that's, to me, like, open science felt like, oh, actually I can stay in academia, but let's try to, change the systems, like block by block. And that's the way I see it, at least. So instead of being just out of academia and being like, whatever, I don't care about this stuff anymore.
I mean, in 2015, it was very risky, although it felt like there was moving in that direction. But now it's like, open science is in a lot of job ads. It's in, it is, there is this thing going, it's really solid.
It's a viable
so
career.
I'm happy. It really is now. And that, now we have computational social science, but those people are predisposed to like open science, based on training and the types of people they interact with and softwares and whatnot. So I don't want to make the podcast go too long, but you should do an episode on this researcher Juan Apricio's interesting work on Colombian kidnappings, and I would find that super interesting, although it might not fit with the
topic.
replication theme. But
thank you. I've heard the guy is amazing.
No, I don't want to talk to this guy.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you
It's
so
been a
much, Nate.
pleasure, real pleasure.
Thanks everyone listening.
Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.